Let's have a conversation about BenQ newest Pro Designer flagship display, PD3225U. There's a lot to go over, so let's get going. This is ArtIsRight. Full disclosure, I am BenQ Pro Display Global Ambassador, which includes their PD series, which I am about to review, and their SW hardware calibrated display for photographers. BenQ sent me this unit to do unboxing, review, long-term testing, and tutorials, which I'll be releasing on my channel. All the opinions you're about to hear regarding this display are solely my own. This said, let's quickly go over the differences between the PD and the SW display line for those of you that are newer to the channel. Starting out, who did BenQ really make this PD display for? As the name suggested, pro designers. So if you do any type of design work for both print and web, this is definitely going to be the one that you want to choose. In addition to this, we also have CAD/CAM animators with color mode that are really designed for animators to go in and lift the shadows. You can see more of the shadow detail. And there's also a CAD/CAM mode as well that will enhance wireframe. In fact, what you can even do is a split view where on one side display, you're viewing, for instance, sRGB color. On the other side, you're viewing a wireframe in the CAD/CAM mode, so you can see those wireframes clearly and see how they translate into the actual creation that you're making. And these PD series also include a DICOM color mode, which you can use to view medical imaging. A new group of creators that have been added into this display lineup as well are content creators. So if you're doing work for web, this is definitely the series that you want to consider. However, these type of content creators can run a broad range of genre. So if you're doing, for example, color critical, color grading work for video, these are serious work that you're doing. You may be better off getting an SW display line because it has the hardware calibration capability, meaning that you're going to get a much more precise color coming from that panel compared to the PD series, which, by the way, this is no slouch already, but if you want the most precise color possible, the hardware calibrated display in the SW series are definitely the way to go. The other group of creators are photographers, such as myself. Now, you're probably asking, are these displays appropriate for photographers? And it really all depends. If the work that you're doing is really for web for display consumption only, then absolutely, I think PD display line will work well for that. However, if you are a photographer and you want to get the most precise color possible, especially if you print, and more so if you own an inkjet printer in your home office or studio, you definitely want to consider getting the SW hardware calibrated display instead, because they have hardware calibration capability for super precise color. You're also going to get on any SW display lineup 99% Adobe RGB color gamut coverage, and that color gamut coverage is really designed for printing type workflow, whereas these, they're going to be great, but they're really designed with display P3 in mind that are really more for display viewing workflow. So some of the variation between those two there, and hopefully this clarifies things up a little bit. So let's talk about the displays behind me. I have both of these displays linked up to my 16-inch MacBook Pro with the M3 Max SoC, and it's done via one cable because both of these displays have Thunderbolt capability. Well, interestingly enough, I have my laptop linked up to the PD3225U. This is a new model. Or, wait a minute, is this the 3225U or is it this one? Well, I've kind of been alluding this whole time that this is a new model, and yes, this is the new 3225U, whereas this is the previous generation, the predecessor PD3220U. Now, I have both of these on the table. I'm not necessarily going to make this a full comparison video between these two, but when it comes to the point where it makes sense for me to draw a comparison about what have improved, what has been made better in the new 3225U, I am going to point towards that. A couple of other things to really note about these two models is that the industrial design on the exterior is exactly the same. There's no change between the two. And one more thing as well that I want to touch on before we get into diving into this PD3225U is that if I do any type of visual comparison between these two displays, the panel and inside, do bear in mind that the PD3220U, the one that I have, is one of the first batch run that they have released. So it's going to be some variation. They might have changed some manufacturing process throughout the lineup that has been run. So there may be some differences, but this is going to give you some idea. And what I want to do towards the end and the conclusion of this video as well is talk about if you are a creative, if you're looking to get a new display, which one you might want to consider. I'm also going to go over if you have, for example, a PD3225U ready, should you get a new one or get another one of these? That's a really good question as well. Or if you have an SW line, you want to add another one into the lineup, is this a good one to add onto it? So we're going to answer all those questions and more towards the end in the conclusion as well. But now, as I mentioned already, the exterior industrial design is pretty much exactly identical to each other. I happen to have one of the first generation PD3225U, so the base is a little bit smaller. However, on the later iterations of this model, the 3220U, they have also made the base the same size as the PD3225U. So exterior, everything is the same, but the difference is the internal. The panel inside the 3225U is entirely brand new, and BenQ is using LG IPS Black. A trend I've been noticing with display and laptop manufacturers is now they're disclosing who their panel manufacturers are. It's really great for us because it gives us a baseline for the panel performance. But what BenQ is doing here is they're taking a panel, they're incorporating this into their own design, incorporating their backlight technology in it, and applying a lot of BenQ magic, which what I would call their AccuColor technology. And this has to do with a whole bunch of calibration process, which I'll cover in just a moment. But let's quickly talk about the panel first. So what we're looking at is a 32-inch 4K 3840 by 2160. That is a ultra high definition UHD, 16:9 aspect ratio, 60 Hz refresh rate, a 10-bit panel done by an 8-bit plus FRC. That means you're still going to get the 1.07 billion colors with a whole bunch of fidelity that you've seen before in this panel. But what have really improved from the previous generation is the contrast ratio. We now have a 2000:1 contrast ratio that has been bumped up from the 1000:1. And when you're viewing the pictures on this display, especially when you're viewing an image comparison to, for instance, an Apple Liquid Retina XDR display inside the 14 or 16-inch MacBook Pro, it becomes apparent that the matching, especially in the dark areas, is much better on the PD3225U. And when you really see the colors between the two, this is really close to what you're really seeing on a MacBook Pro display compared to the previous generation. So a huge improvement there. In addition to this, BenQ have also gone in and bumped up the max brightness nit of this display from 250 in the 3220U to now 400 in the 3225U, and is also VESA HDR 400 certified as well. So this really means that you can really view high dynamic range content on this display, and you will have up to 400 nits of brightness that you can utilize. So a lot of really great things in this display. The great things that have come before, for instance, being that it is an IPS panel with an LED backlight, it's still there, meaning that you're going to still get an amazing angle of view from side to side that you would normally get from an IPS panel. In addition to this, because this is a 32-inch 4K, the pixel pitch on this display is around 140 pixels per inch. Now, some of you may be wondering, like, is this year and age already? Is 32-inch 4K still a thing? Should we really still use this display? And I'm going to say this, that when you plug this display into the Mac, it's automatically going to scale the resolution. However, some have also mentioned that, well, Apple doesn't really do this on their Apple Studio 5K, and the answer to that is yes, they do. So if you go into system preferences, Apple automatically scaled the resolution on those. The magic of the 5K in a 27-inch model is that you have a pixel per inch, or the pixel pitch, that is greater than 200 pixels per inch, and this qualifies for something that is really called the Retina display, or HD DPI. Whereas this, it doesn't really quite meet that number, but it does come close. And for me, I have been using these 4K displays in both 27 and 32-inch for almost a decade now, and I will probably say, like, it's really haven't been an issue. This is something, though, that I will say it's really personal to a lot of people. Some of them don't like the fact that, I mean, you know, the pixels are not really quite meeting that sharp, that crisp 200 pixels per inch, and this may be something that you might want to look at. But the other thing that I do want to point out as well is that comparing this to, for instance, the 27-inch studio display is probably not a fair comparison, because that's 27-inch, this is 32. So to compare this properly, when it comes to 32-inch display, you need a panel that is 6K resolution. And so far, Apple's probably the only company, and there may be only other one or two more that are doing 6K resolution. Most of the other display manufacturers now are pushing the 8K resolution threshold. The problem with 8K displays right now in a 32-inch chassis, 32-inch size panel, is that the price is really prohibitive. So you're really running into all of these in betweens, like, how do I choose? Now, here's the thing. You may hear a lot of other commentators say as well that 4K is not compatible with Mac. Like, I'm proving this to you right now. This is linked up to my Macintosh system. So the compatibility is not the right term to use in this regard. Now, Mac, I'm going to say this, whether you have an Intel or an Apple Silicon, is definitely not a magical unicorn. As long as you have the proper connector and you have a compatible display technology, you can plug that in without any problem. Mac OS does not care what your display resolution is, what your display pixel pitch is. It's going to output the pixels and the colors to the display. So I just want to get off that bandwagon quickly to share with you the information that yes, these are fully compatible without any problems. Now, like I said, if you're not really keen on 4K scale resolution, something to think about is to maybe look up at a 6K or an 8K display. So those would be the things that you want to think about. All right, now let's talk about the color specification of this display. So this one can show 98% P3 color gamut with 99% sRGB and Rec 709, compared to the PD3225U that can show 95% P3. So the color gamut on this display have also increased with display P3. The other thing that I will point out is that on all the calibration that I've done, especially when I compare these two displays, calibrating in the various color modes that come with the display, using Calibrite Profiler and Calibrite Display Plus HL device, most of the time, in all the color modes, I am able to get a max delta E less than 1 on the PD3225U, whereas it's less than 2 on the PD3220U. So the color response, the ability to correct this to gamut on this panel, is also much better in this new PD3225U. And this is starting to give us an idea already, like, hey, if you're looking to get a new one, this may be definitely the one that you want to consider. PD series display is part of BenQ Pro monitor lineup, and they will always ship with an individual calibration report from the factory that tells you how your panel is performing. For PD3225U, BenQ is guaranteeing that you're going to get a delta E of less than 2 from the factory. That is the max delta E. For the predecessor PD3225U, BenQ guarantees that you're going to get a delta E of less than 3. The one thing I want to really clarify up here is that I have unboxed so many PD displays already, including the entry-level 24, 25-inch 8-bit panel. And even with those displays, the max delta E has always been less than 2, even though BenQ has said that the delta E is less than 3. Majority of this is really just marketing to differentiate the PD from the SAU display lineup. So regardless if you're getting a new one or you're getting a previous generation PD display that has a delta E value of less than 3 guarantee, you're still going to get an amazing panel that is going to come out less than 2 on the delta E max. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with this, delta E describes the color variation on the display from reference. So this is based on human vision, and what I can tell you right now is that a delta E of, I would probably say, anything less than 3 is considered good, anything less than 2 is considered amazing for any type of creative work, and anything less than 2, for the most part, you can't really tell the colors apart with a normal human vision unless they're pretty much side by side next to each other, which when we do creation, our color homogenize anyway, so you're going to get a great panel directly from BenQ. The other thing you note about these displays as well, particularly PD3225U, is that there's CalMan Verify, Pantone, and Pantone Skin Tone Validated. Now, if you're not familiar with that, that means BenQ have sent these display out to get tested at these different companies so that they can verify that the panel meets the strict quality to have that stamp of approval. And I've been through the process on the back end of Pantone validation, and it's really not just quite sending the display there. They have to send multiple display from different batch for Pantone to do tests, and there are various testing they have done. Now, Pantone Validated is good because it guarantees that you're going to be able to match Pantone colors without any problems on the display, but Pantone Skin Tone Validation is even a stricter validation process, and it passes flying colors, which is the reason why this display have both stamp of approval from Pantone and also its CalMan verified as well. So these are just things I want to point out about the display. Now, the other thing that I want to go over about this panel is that being an IPS, sometimes we get panel unevenness, and this is where BenQ AccuColor technology comes in. Their magic really comes in, because one of the things that I do from the factory is calibrate this panel for uniformity. So they have made multiple measurements throughout the entire panel sub-regions, and they program this into the display firmware. What you're really going to get in the back end is an image that looks amazing from side to side, top to bottom. In fact, I've also run a panel uniformity on this, and I can tell you right now that throughout all the 9 quadrants for both Delta E 2000 and Delta EAB, the variation is always less than 2, with the max about 1.95, and that's only in 1 quadrant on one of the qualification. Everything else have passed with flying colors. So the panel uniformity you're going to get with the PD3225U is really amazing. The other thing that BenQ is really doing with their AccuColor technology is performing a lot of calibration from the factory in the various color modes. For example, what you're going to get on this display is display P3, DCI P3, sRGB, Rec 79. There's a CAD-CAM animator mode. There's also a mode that's really specific to BenQ called MBook. And with MBook color mode, what they're really doing is they're tweaking the P3 color gamut so that it matches really closely with what you're going to get from an Apple built-in display, such as the one in the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro. And I've been running the test on the side-by-side in MBook mode, and I can tell you right now that the colors look really close to each other. One hint though, if you're planning to use MBook mode, is that you want to use MBook mode natively as is without calibrating your display in MBook mode. So you just want that to match pretty much natively. However, if you're going to run your display in, for instance, display P3, I highly recommend that you go in and do a custom calibration, because you're going to get that color just a slight bit more precise than you were able to do with just plugging it in directly. Now let's talk connectivity. I mentioned earlier that the PD3225U has Thunderbolt 3 connectivity, and with this, it makes the connection very simple. Just one singular cable, I'm able to link this display to my laptop, and is also providing 85 watts of power to my laptop in addition to carrying all the I/O signals as well. In addition to this, because it's Thunderbolt, it also has enough bandwidth to carry another 4K 60Hz signal to another display. Hence, this is how I'm linking up the PD3220U using a USB-C cable that's daisy-chained to the PD3225U. In fact, if you have an SW display that require hardware calibration, even the 4K model, you can daisy chain it exactly the same way, and Palette Master Ultimate will be able to calibrate your SW display without any issues whatsoever. What I've also run some testing on is plug in a USB Type-C 3.0 SSD into this daisy chain display and run some speed tests on it. And the speed that I'm able to get are still USB 3 speed and not USB 2.0, so it has been downgraded or anything like that. Another really great technology is between using DisplayPort daisy chain and all those things, so everything is really working well with this type of connectivity. In addition to this, the connectivity is very similar to the predecessor. You have 2 HDMI 2.0 ports and 1 DisplayPort 1.4. That is a full-size DisplayPort. In addition to this, you also have a 3.5mm headphone jack. You have 3 USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports on this display, and also 1 USB Type-C port, including an upstream port as well, if you want to link this up to your computer that does not have, for example, USB Type-C connection. On the right side of the display, this is where some of the ports are going to be. So for example, you're going to have a USB Type-A, USB Type-C, and also the headphone out. And this display also supports KVM as well. So when you switch the source, you can also switch the input using just one singular set of mouse and keyboard. In addition to this, the display also has an updated 2.5 watt speakers on there, upgrade from the 2 watt speakers on the predecessor model. Now, these speakers are not anything to really run home about, but nonetheless, if you want to play the sound through the display, you can certainly do that. The last thing I want to really go over regarding connectivity has to do with the hotkey puck, and we're still getting the hotkey puck Gen 2 that is wired, knowing that if you follow my channel, you have seen that I review the SW272U and Q series that comes with wireless hotkey puck Gen 3. I was hoping that when they launch this one, they would do some additional modifications and make this the wireless hotkey puck Gen 3, but that is not the case. So right now, you're still using the wired hotkey puck Gen 2. So just something to keep in mind there. The functionality otherwise is good. In addition to this, you also have various mode on these display as well. Something that I have alluded to earlier is the fact that you can split the display into 2 different color modes. For instance, what we can do here is go into input, and you can do different type of pictures in pictures. And I only have one source link up right now when I'm talking about this, so you're not going to be able to see much, but you can do a picture in picture. You can also make this, for instance, a picture by picture, or you can even do 4x4 up. That means you can have all the inputs showing all at once. You can have certain inputs showing twice at the very same time, and there's different ways to configure that. So the configurability of this display is actually quite well. What you have in general, very similar to the predecessor that come before, is on 4 sides, you have this infinity display that looks really nice. You can immerse yourself in the content right away. In addition to this new hardware, BenQ have also updated their companion software, now called Display Pilot 2. With this version, compared to the one that have come before, you now have a much more polished interface and a deeper integration with their PD display, specifically the PD3225U. Even though this will work with other PD displays in the lineup as well, such as the PD3220U, there are more integrations with the newer models that have been released. For instance, with the PD3225U, you can use the function key on your keyboard. For example, if you're using a Mac system, and you can change the display brightness and also the volume directly on the display. So if you're using the display speakers, those function key will function just well for those. A couple of caveats to note is that, for instance, if you have a setup very similar to mine right now, where you have an Apple laptop that is running in open mode like this, link up to the display, anytime you press those function key on a keyboard, it will default to the Apple product first. So the volume will go to the Mac first, the brightness will go to the Mac built-in display first. To get around that, simply put the laptop in the clamshell mode, and if you have an external keyboard, you can then adjust the brightness on the display without any problems. If you're running on a Mac desktop, this will pretty much integrate directly right in. So Display Pilot 2 is a move in the right direction, something that I really enjoy seeing, especially those kind of integrations with the operating system. In addition to this, you also have ICC sync function that helps you manage ICC across multiple displays to make sure that they remain in sync. You get the best color possible. You also have the ability to go in and do software dimming on the display, so you can have greater control over the brightness. I mean, depending on your workflow, some may need that, some may not. Personally, I think the controls on the display offer me enough adequate controls already, but if you want to dim the display even further, this software dimming is going to give you more room to do that. In addition to this, it also has the desktop partition function. If you don't have a window manager already, where you can snap a window to a certain side of the display and so forth, this desktop partition is really a good tool to have, and definitely something to play around with. And even though you may not have a PD display lineup, these are functions that are generic enough that if you have an SW display, you can still use the desktop partition function inside the application. Now, something that's a little bit more specific to PD is that there is an application mode. This means as you launch in a certain application, it will detect that and will automatically change the color mode on the display and change the ICC profile at the same time, so you don't have to think about that depending on your workflow. And lastly, there is a print assist mode. So this will show you an overlay for the different paper size or different print size. It would show up. So if you want to really make an estimate as how this will print out, you can certainly do that on the display, and there's different ways to customize those. In addition to this, BenQ have also released another piece of companion software called Display Color Talk. And what it's really designed to do is to help you adjust and match 2 displays together. This could be 2 PD displays, or for instance, if you're running in MBook mode and you have a Mac with a built-in display link up to your system, you can certainly use Display Color Talk to try to match your BenQ PD display to what you're really seeing on your Mac. In general, I don't really recommend using this function so much, because you're really starting to push and pull tones in ways how it's really hard to see the ramification of those changes. But if your eventual goal is for absolute color perfection between this display, it is something great to try out. And the process of doing that is very similar to how you would use curves and how you do color adjustment in Lightroom and Photoshop. For instance, it will show you a color on both sides of the display, and what you would simply do is adjust the various sliders until the color match as close as possible. Remember though that this process is also relying on human vision, and my best recommendation is to go in and calibrate the display individually so you don't run into that issue. And lastly, as I talk about calibration, remember that if you're running in inbook mode, I don't recommend calibrating that at all, because that is the color mode that's specifically designed to match Apple Display that's really not meant to be calibrated. And that is pretty much PD3225U in a nutshell. So let's answer some questions. You may be asking, if I'm looking for a 32-inch 4K right now, which one should I choose? I would probably say if you have the option between the PD3225U and a PD3220U, unless you can find the 3220U at an amazing value on clearance or something like that, I would probably say go with a PD3225U, because the panel is better, the contrast ratio is better, and including the calibration performance that I'm able to get throughout different color modes. The Delta E, most of the time, the highest I was able to get was like around 1.1 on the max, and that's really amazing. This is something that was hard for me to achieve on the PD3220U, whereas most of the time Delta E remains below 2, but it's still teetering on that 2 mark on different color modes. So those would be one of the things to think about. So if you're buying one brand new, I would say go for the new one, unless you're really getting a great deal on the previous one. So let's say you already have a PD3220U. Should you get one that matches exactly, or buy a PD3225U? My recommendation would be to get this one, because this is an improvement in the panel that I would say it's justified going up to the newer model. And lastly, for those of you that have an SW display already, let's say you have the SW321C or the SW320, you want to add another 32-inch 4K, but you don't necessarily want to add another SW display in the lineup. I think these would be great companions to that. And when it comes to that, like I said before, if you're looking at just these two models, I would definitely go with a new one, unless you're having or you're able to find an amazing deal on a PD3220U, then I might go for that one. But most of the time, after playing with this, after testing this, after putting it through as rigorous testing, I would say the new one is definitely a leap improvement from the previous generation that comes before. And one last thing that I forgot to mention earlier in the video is the fact that on the PD3220U, BenQ have also included an Adobe RGB color mode on this display, whereas on the 3225U, that Adobe RGB color mode is no longer there. The one thing that you may not notice is that even though Adobe RGB is there on the predecessor, it's not really conforming to the Adobe RGB color gamut. What it's really doing is just the Adobe RGB color mode in name only, because the color gamut conformed closer to P3 color gamut rather than Adobe RGB. So for these displays, if you really ask me, you're going to get around 80–84% Adobe RGB color gamut or so, which is part of the reason why they didn't even do any type of programming from the factory. And one last thing to really touch on regarding these two when we compare the calibration of them in P3 color mode is that the color gamut is definitely much better on this PD3225U. So I hope that I'm able to answer many questions that you have regarding these two display models. How is this better than the previous one? What are some improvements that have come along? And why I find that this is the most impressive flagship in the PD series so far that BenQ has released. And I'm looking for more to come from BenQ at this point in time. So that's my thought about it. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Give this a like, subscribe, and hit the bell you new, and in art we trust.